It is rare to hear a cardinal describe the current state of the Catholic Church in terms this severe. And yet his conclusion, when it finally arrives, is entirely unambiguous. Paganism has entered the Church. He did not say this for shock value or to provoke a reaction on social media. He said it at the end of a calm, measured conversation that began with a simple question and arrived, through careful reasoning rather than rhetorical escalation, at a conclusion of real gravity. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how he reached that conclusion, why he believes the resistance to the ancient Mass across many dioceses does not originate with the Pope himself, and why the word synodality, repeated endlessly across recent church documents, strikes him as fundamentally unsound. This account comes from a long interview given to journalist Diane Montagna, in which Cardinal Robert Sarah, an African churchman who spent years as the Vatican's chief liturgical official as prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship, spoke with unusual candor about what he sees happening inside the church he has served for decades. And the conversation began, notably, with praise. Praise that almost no one covering this interview has actually mentioned, because the first person Sarah singled out for commendation was Pope Leo XIV himself. Sarah recalled that the Pope had written to the bishops of France, encouraging them to show greater openness toward the traditional Mass, and he approved of that letter without reservation. "It seems to me," he said, "that the Holy Father did well in writing to the French bishops, encouraging them to be more open to the traditional Mass, since we have celebrated it for centuries." And then he added a passage that reads almost like a warning directed at the broader episcopate. What was written to the French bishops, he said, ought to apply to every bishop everywhere. Be more open so as not to create needless divisions. In concrete terms, this means a parish priest who wishes to celebrate Mass according to the ancient rite should not have to request permission as though asking for a special favor reluctantly granted. And a community attached to that liturgy should not be treated as a problem requiring containment and management. This is the detail that reshapes the entire framing of this controversy, because according to Sarah's reading of the situation, the responsibility for the ongoing restriction of the traditional Mass does not rest with the Pope. "We must follow the counsel of Pope Leo," he stated plainly. "Do not be hostile toward what is sacred, what is beautiful, and what fosters genuine reflection before God." In other words, the Pope opens the door. The bishops, in practice, keep closing it. That gap, according to Sarah, is precisely where the real problem lies. Then comes the decisive argument, delivered in a handful of words that carry more weight than an entire legal treatise. "I do not know," Sarah said, "by what authority we would prevent a liturgy that has been celebrated for centuries." And he pressed the point further. This Tridentine liturgy has 16 centuries behind it. We cannot say that what has been done for 1600 years is no longer valid today. Pause on that for a moment, because this is a foundational objection, and precisely because it is foundational, it is devastating in its simplicity. If something has been held sacred for 16 centuries, who possesses the authority to suddenly declare it improper, dangerous, or unworthy of continued use? This is not an abstract number being cited for rhetorical effect. This is the Mass of the martyrs and the saints. The liturgy that formed generation after generation of Christians, that accompanied Europe's journey from the catacombs to her great cathedrals, that shaped the interior life of every canonized saint of the Western Church prior to 1970. To erase it, or to functionally suppress it through administrative restriction, is like tearing a page out of the family album and pretending the family's history began somewhere else. Sarah, however, is not calling for revolution or open confrontation. He expresses hope that the restrictive document currently governing the traditional Mass will eventually be revoked. But he also suggests a gentler path forward. that the Pope simply continue encouraging openness and that the restrictions fade gradually, day by day and year by year, through a quiet and patient change in pastoral practice rather than through a dramatic and confrontational reversal. But why does the liturgy deserve this much attention and concern in the first place? Is this not simply a matter of sacristy preference, of interest only to enthusiasts with a particular taste in ceremonial style? For the Cardinal, the answer is the exact opposite. Today, he insists, this is the most urgent question facing the Church, because it concerns nothing less than the relationship between man and God. Man, he says, must kneel before God, adore him, thank him, and submit to his will. And he adds a sentence that ought to give every parish priest genuine pause. We need a sacred liturgy, he says, not a game, not entertainment. The Cardinal then turns to the word that has dominated Catholic ecclesiastical vocabulary in recent years, and here he does not soften his language in the slightest. I have never understood this shift, he says, this labeling of the Church as synodal. He has always believed the Church to be the mystical body of Christ, mother, teacher, and bride. Why give her another name entirely? And this question is not a matter of mere semantics or formal preference, because a name is never simply a label attached from outside. A name describes a reality. If the Church becomes synodal in her essential self-understanding, the center of gravity shifts, subtly but decisively, away from the teaching of Christ and toward an assembly engaged in ongoing debate and negotiation. This is precisely the practical risk that Sarah is naming and warning against. The Church is not an assembly of all Christians gathered to vote on positions and express personal opinions as though truth were determined by majority consensus. The Church exists to teach. From this follows the principle that sits at the very center of everything Sarah is arguing. Doctrine is not something one votes on. A moral teaching cannot be put to a ballot. It is a teaching received from God, not authored or amended by any human assembly, however broadly representative that assembly claims to be. And he offers a direct and unambiguous example to illustrate exactly what he means. Something does not become morally acceptable simply because a majority declares it so, when the Book of Revelation and the Catechism of the Catholic Church clearly state the contrary. Majority opinion, however sincerely held and however broadly shared, cannot overturn what has been definitively revealed and definitively taught. He then turns to the specific document currently under discussion, the final text produced by one of the synodal study groups addressing precisely these contested questions. Sarah has asked the Pope to personally review this document before its publication. His concern is stated plainly, that a working group shaped predominantly by Western sensibilities and Western cultural assumptions might end up imposing its own particular perspective on the universal Church, as though that perspective were simply Catholic teaching itself, applicable without modification across every culture and continent. This, in his view, is precisely what happened previously with Fiducia Supplicans, the document on blessings that produced sharp and public division rather than the unity it was intended to promote. And he issues a warning. There will be negative reactions, he says, and this precedent carries serious consequences. That earlier document provoked a unanimous response from the bishops of Africa, who stated publicly and collectively that its provisions would not be implemented on their continent, an unforeseen and uncomfortable division that Sarah fears could easily repeat itself with whatever new document emerges from the current synodal process. And he poses a question that, as an African churchman himself, carries particular weight and personal significance for him. Who actually composes this working group? From which nations? From which cultures? African, Asian, European, Oceanic? Is the group genuinely representative of the universal church's full cultural breadth, or does it reflect primarily the assumptions of one particular region imposing itself on all the others under the language of universal application? Here, though, it needs to be said clearly that this is not framed as an attack against the Pope himself. It is instead a question of institutional trust and procedural care. The Holy Father, Sarah says, is very prudent and will not permit the circulation of a text he has not personally approved after careful and attentive examination. And here we arrive at the passage that gives this entire interview its title. The single moment that has travelled furthest through Catholic media in the days since Diane Montagna published her conversation with the Cardinal. Sarah recounts the one occasion in his long career when he felt genuinely compelled to criticize Pope Francis publicly. And the memory he chooses to share is not a minor or peripheral one. He returns to the Amazon Synod of 2019, and he asks a question that has clearly stayed with him across the years since. Why, he asks, was Our Lady of Guadalupe, venerated across the entirety of Latin America as the great patroness of the continent, not invited to preside symbolically over that synod in some meaningful way? In her place, he says, an idol was brought into St. Peter's itself. This is a direct reference to the Pachamama controversy that erupted during the Amazon Synod, when statues representing an indigenous fertility figure were displayed and venerated in ceremonies held within the Vatican gardens and later inside a church near St. Peter's Basilica, an episode that provoked genuine and widespread alarm among Catholics across multiple continents, not only among those already inclined toward traditionalist sympathies. Sarah's memory of that moment has clearly not faded, and his willingness to invoke it again now, years later, in the context of a broader concern about synodal processes and Western cultural imposition, signals how significant he considers that episode to remain. Then he turns to something more recent, the papal visit to Singapore, during which Pope Francis made remarks describing the different world religions as comparable to different paths, different languages or dialects, all ultimately leading toward the same God. Sarah raises what he considers the unavoidable theological objection to that framing. But then he asks, what meaning does the Incarnation actually retain? What was the point of God becoming man in Jesus Christ, of the Son of God entering human history at a specific time and place, if all religious paths lead equally and interchangeably to the same divine destination, regardless of what any of them specifically teaches or believes? And if that comparative framing were genuinely accurate, he adds, then Christ himself would have been speaking falsely when he stated plainly that no one comes to the Father except through him. It is from this specific chain of reasoning, built carefully across the Amazon Synod, the Pachamama episode, and the Singapore remarks, rather than from any single isolated incident taken out of context, that Sarah arrives at his final and most striking conclusion. In other words, he says, paganism has entered the Church. This is not a conclusion he reaches lightly or rhetorically. It is the accumulated weight of several specific episodes, each involving what he perceives as an erosion of the Church's unique claim to possess and to proclaim the fullness of revealed truth in Jesus Christ, replaced gradually by a framework in which all spiritual paths are treated as more or less equivalent expressions of a shared human search for the divine. And yet, even having reached that severe conclusion, the underlying principle Sarah continues to defend throughout remains entirely stable and beyond question. No one, under any circumstance, and regardless of pastoral pressure or cultural sensitivity, can change the doctrine that Christ himself established and entrusted to his Church. It does not belong to us, he insists. There is no paradigm shift available to any pope, any synod, or any council that could legitimately alter what has been definitively revealed. So what remains then For those of us watching all of this unfold from our own respective parishes, far from Rome and far from the synodal assemblies and the theological working groups, whose internal composition and deliberations we will likely never see in detail. What remains is a task that is simple, ancient, and entirely within reach of every ordinary Catholic, regardless of their theological sophistication or their proximity to ecclesiastical power. To kneel, to adore, to protect what has been entrusted to us without ever treating it as a game or a matter of passing preference. Because if, as the Cardinal fears, something genuinely foreign has entered into our own household, into the very heart of the Church's worship and teaching, the appropriate response is not anger, and it is certainly not schism or rupture with the visible structure of the Church that Christ himself established. The appropriate response is a return to what Catholics have always known how to do best across every previous crisis the Church has weathered in her 2,000-year history: prayer, reverence for the sacred, fidelity to what has been received rather than invention of something new to replace it. And prayer specifically for the Pope himself, that he may retain and exercise precisely the prudence that Sarah credits him with throughout this entire interview, the careful discernment that distinguishes a shepherd genuinely guarding the deposit of faith from one who allows well-intentioned advisors and regional working groups to reshape that deposit according to contemporary cultural pressures. There is something genuinely important in how Sarah structures this entire conversation that deserves to be named explicitly before closing, because it distinguishes his intervention from the kind of blanket condemnation that some other traditionalist voices in this same period have offered regarding the current pontificate. Sarah begins by praising Leo XIV specifically and directly for his letter to the French bishops. He locates the primary obstacle to liturgical peace not in the Pope's own stated intentions, but in the resistance and reluctance of individual bishops who have not yet followed the Pope's own explicit guidance. He credits the Pope with genuine prudence regarding the synodal document under preparation, expressing confidence that Leo will not permit its publication without careful and attentive personal review. And only after establishing all of this does he arrive at his most severe conclusion regarding paganism entering the Church, and even that conclusion is anchored specifically in incidents from the previous pontificate rather than framed as a direct indictment of Leo XIV's own governance to date. This structure matters because it demonstrates something about how a genuinely faithful critique operates within the Catholic tradition, as distinct from the kind of wholesale rejection of legitimate authority that characterizes positions like sedevacantism or Archbishop Vigano's more totalizing condemnations of the entire post-conciliar Church. Sarah is not declaring the papacy itself compromised or illegitimate. He is not suggesting that Catholics should look elsewhere for authentic teaching authority. He is doing something considerably more traditional and, in its own way, more demanding. He is naming specific concerns, specific incidents, and specific patterns of behavior among specific bishops and specific synodal working groups, while continuing to affirm his trust in the Pope's own personal judgment and his continued submission to the Pope's authority as the legitimate shepherd of the universal Church. This is what faithful criticism from within the Church has always looked like across her long history, from the earliest councils through every subsequent era of doctrinal controversy and reform. It does not require declaring the entire institution corrupted beyond recognition or constructing an alternative structure outside the visible Church's authority. It requires precisely what Sarah demonstrates throughout this interview: careful theological reasoning, historical memory, respect for legitimate authority, even while raising serious concerns about how that authority is being exercised at various levels below the papacy itself, and an unwavering commitment to the doctrine that no synod, no working group, and no cultural pressure can be permitted to alter, regardless of how reasonable or compassionate the arguments for changing it might sound in any given moment. The word Sarah chose, paganism, is a severe word, and it deserves to be received with the seriousness it carries, rather than dismissed as hyperbole or embraced uncritically as confirmation of whatever suspicions a given listener already holds about the current state of the Church. It points toward a genuine concern about syncretism, about the blurring of the unique and unrepeatable claim that Christianity makes regarding Christ as the sole mediator between God and humanity. A claim that Sarah believes certain gestures and certain public statements in recent years have functionally compromised even without any formal doctrinal declaration ever being issued to that effect. But the response Sarah calls for in the face of that concern is not rebellion. It is restoration through fidelity, kneeling, adoring, protecting what has been received, praying for the Pope rather than abandoning confidence in the papacy itself. This is the narrow and difficult path that faithful criticism within the Catholic tradition has always required. And it is the path Cardinal Sarah, even at 80 years of age, and even having devoted decades of his life and priesthood to defending the sacred liturgy against what he perceives as its ongoing erosion, continues to walk without ever stepping outside the bounds of the Church he has served his entire life. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.